I'm going to do a couple of extreme perspectives, but before I do that, I need to do some review and some preview of some ideas from different types of perspectives, because I've left out a lot of the basic terminology that an architect might have, but an artist doesn't need. The picture plane, of course, is this piece of paper, but you don't know what a station point is, nor do you really need to know that at this point. What you do need to know is what your center of vision is. Your center of vision at this point is near the vanishing point, which is in the center of the picture. But I'm also going to put two other vanishing points out here to show you some two-point perspective, and then we're going to go into three so you can sort of see what's going on. For a two-point perspective, my center of vision is also somewhere about halfway between the vanishing points. But for a three-point perspective, which I'll show you in a little while, we're going to move that center of vision to be more the center of a triangle. So I'm going to go straight up from the center of this horizon, and I'm going to put another vanishing point up top. Keep in mind that in a four-point perspective, there's also a vanishing point equal distance below the horizon. So now I have what's basically an isosceles triangle, and my center of vision moves up to here. The idea being that in a single-point perspective, the closer you get to the vanishing point, the better things look, and in a two-point or a three-point perspective, the closer you get to the center of those vanishing points, the better things look. And the closer you get to the vanishing points, the more warped things tend to look. A couple of objects here in different types of perspective. The first will be what we've seen before. This is a single point box, and I'm going to make basically a squarish end. And then I'm going to connect three lines back to the single vanishing point in the middle. And once I've done that, I'm going to break off the box about a third of the way or half of the way to the ends, just to make it look box-like. Box is in two-point perspective. At this point, I'm going to make one that's crossing the horizon and one that's below the horizon. The one below the horizon we'll be able to see down on top of, and the one that's crossing the horizon we'll just be able to see two sides. There are no more horizontals for us now. Our lines are now vertical or to one of the vanishing points. This is a base two-point perspective. We'll go more into this later on in a different video, but at this point, take my word for it, this is the basis of two-point perspective. And remember that one that's below the horizon is just like one above the horizon, except you would see underneath it instead. So if I flip the entire page, you would be able to see that. So here we have one crossing the horizon, and then I'm going to put the top on this box back here. Notice that those go to the opposite vanishing points, and now I have two boxes in two-point perspective. Next, I'm going to show you a three-point perspective using this dot here at the top. Here's two 2-points and one 3-point. Now for a three-point perspective, there are no more verticals, there are no more horizontals, there's only to the vanishing point. So I have two vanishing points that I made in a triangle, a third one at the top. So I draw a line to each of them from a single point, and then I'm going to break it off like a box. Everything goes towards the vanishing point. There are no more horizontals, no more verticals. There's just this box floating in space. I put it above the horizon. We can see underneath it, and we can see two sides. So that is a base three-point perspective, like a big old safe falling from the sky. I'm showing you this because I'm going to focus on some of the vanishing points that we don't often use, or the ones we haven't used before in these videos, particularly the one up in the sky and the one that mirrors it down below on the ground, to give you an extreme bird's eye or drone's eye view and an extreme worm's eye view. But any time that you focus on one vanishing point over another, you end up with a single point perspective. So basically, as you turn from one vanishing point to another, you turn from one single point to one single point. I'm going to start with a single point perspective of an extreme bird's eye view of the city. To do that, I'm going to put a vanishing point in the center, then I'm going to draw a rectangle around it. If I put a building on top of it, this is what it would look like. This isn't going to be a building, this is going to be a street, and I'm going to put in a sidewalk over here, so I just put in a couple lines next to each other, and then I'm going to start putting in a building. And to do that, I'm going to put in the bottom edge first. You can start from the top and work down, or you can start from the bottom and work up like I'm doing. And I put in a vertical and a horizontal line to represent the bottom. And now I'm putting in lines from the vanishing point going up, and I'm going to build the top of my box. And when it comes down to it, it's just a box at this point. So I'm doing the same thing I've done before. I'm just making sure that I get them all nice and neatly lined up like they're buildings. Our brains and eyes will assume that these buildings are sitting on the ground. The tops of the buildings will tell us how tall they are by how large the front is compared to the distance from the vanishing point. So in this case, I'm going to draw a building that is shorter than the one next to it. So it will cover over a little bit of the corner of the building, but no higher than the corner of the shorter building. You can see that I'm erasing bits and pieces. Remember that in linear perspective, it's just as important what you draw as what you erase. Now I'm going to start with the front leading corner of this building, and I'm going to put in verticals and horizontal to be the base of the building, and then I'm going to make this one shorter than the other two by making the face literally shorter. You can see that nothing covers over this at this point. Overdrawing and erasing. So everything is nice and neat in place and then cleaned up. The next building that I put in is going to be a water tower, and to do this I'm going to make a cylinder in perspective. First I'm going to make a box to put the cylinder in, and then I'm going to find the center of that box by making an X from corner to corner, and then using that I'm going to go straight up and down, straight side to side. So now I have the midpoints of each of the walls, and I'm going to draw a circle going through those midpoints. Once I've done that, then I can take off that scaffolding. Remember, just important what you draw is what you erase. And then I'm going to take two tangent lines, lines that just touch the edge of that cylinder, down from the top, going down, and I need to match that curve at the bottom. I can't go straight across. I've got to do a curve just like the one on the top. And now I have a cylinder. I'm going to put legs down these lines of perspective, put another one somewhere towards the center, halfway between them. Need to make sure that I line that up with my vanishing point. Looks a little crooked there. It is. Get that in there just the way I want it, and put in some lattice work underneath it, and I have a cylinder. Now let's put in a building back here, maybe a residence. And to do this, I'm going to first make a box on the front. I'm going to find the center of that box by connecting corners. This is the way we find the center of any box, in perspective or not in perspective. And once I've done that, I'm going to draw to the vanishing point through the center of that box. And this is how I make a triangle for the top of the roof. That keeps the peak of the roof directly above the center of the building. And I'm going to draw the roof going back with some straight lines. In this case, I don't need to use the vanishing point, but I do need to mirror the lines on the back of the building to match the front, and the horizontal lines will remain horizontal. I will also take out all of the lines on the front where I found the center of the building and the peak of the roof, because really we don't need those anymore, and we're not likely to need them in the future. As I go along, I'm going to put in more sidewalks and make streets on one side, buildings on the other. I'm going to make some more complicated shaped buildings. Really, they're just boxes in space. That's all they are. Make sure that all the pieces line up nice and neat. I'm going to make a couple of buildings now from the top down. You can see the rectangle on the top goes down very nicely. Here's a couple of irregular shapes. One's just a box, the other one's an L shape. But as I put them in, you can see how the lines of perspective go towards that vanishing point. I have horizontal lines and vertical lines just like any other box. And I'm going to put it in. This, you may be more comfortable putting things in from the top down. It depends. I usually like from the bottom up so I can see where things are sitting on the ground level. I'm going to show you another peaked roof. In this case, on sort of a church-like building, it's going to be an extreme peak. I connect the corners on the rectangle on the side. Then I go through the center and the vanishing point to find where that peak is going to be. It's going to be an extreme peak, And you can see that this triangle is larger on the front side and smaller on the back, which is where it should be in a perspective picture. I'm far from the vanishing point, and I'm going to check out that roof, and to do so I need to make the back wall and find the center as well, and then find where it intersects the line that I drew across from the roof. Farther from the vanishing point, the more warped things get, so that roof is going to look a little weird in the back corner because it's pretty far away from the single vanishing point. I'm going to start getting fancy and putting in some weird sidewalks and alleyways, etc. So just bear with me as I start putting different designs in and doing different thought processes. I do not plan these pictures ahead of time, I just sort of do them and then I explain them. At this point I'm going to start putting in some more sidewalks. Notice that everything on the ground is pretty much flat and rectangular. Windows in on the front of this building, and to do this I'm going to do it, it's kind of the hard way. I put in a floor, and notice I put a diagonal in there. That diagonal is going to match the diagonal of the floor above it, matching the diagonal of the floor above that. And this diagonal, as the building gets wider, will make each of the floors get bigger, but that diagonal will match each and every time. See, I just move it, and then I move it back, and the floors then look larger as they get closer to us, which is the way perspective works. Things closer to you look larger. I can take those diagonals out later. Now, normally I just sort of eyeball it, and I know that as the floors get closer up to me, they're going to be a little bit bigger every time I do it. But technically, the way to do it is with those like angles, those diagonals. So I wanted to show you that. Next, I'm going to make windows on the front, and to do that I'm going to make one row of windows. Then I'm going to take a diagonal and see where that diagonal hits the next floor down, and then I'm going to draw a line through that. And I'm going to do the same thing for the next one. Take a diagonal through the windows next to it and go to the next floor, and that will show me how to evenly space those windows. I ended up with a little bit of extra space, so I'll put a concrete column on the side here. And then I'm going to put in another floor's worth of windows here, matching them up to the windows on the front by finding that front leading corner and getting them all nice and neat and even, making sure that everything's going to the vanishing point. There we go. I'm also going to start putting boxes on the roofs and coffering the tops, which basically means insetting them with little shadow lines. And here I'm going to put an air conditioning unit and another box that might be a little pop-up to allow for people working on the elevator. Doors at the bottom. I'm taking my measurements from the building next to it to get different floors. And see that I'm putting in little walkways and different types of windows on each of these buildings. I'm going to embellish, embellish, embellish. The more lines that you have on here, the more surface line you build up, basically cross contours when it comes down to it, the more details you get in there, the better it will look. Here is that same picture. Minimal shading, a little bit of grass that I started putting in there, but to tell you the truth, it's just the lines that are giving us those depth cues with a single point perspective. We're focusing on the third vanishing point, one way below the horizon, but we're treating it like a single point perspective. Now I want to try the same idea, but from the opposite viewpoint, looking straight up at the sky. I'm going to put a vanishing point somewhere towards the middle of my picture. We're not going to see the bottoms of the buildings because we're standing on the ground and they are actually literally below us. I'm going to draw several lines out from this central point so you can sort of see how things look like they're going back in space. Then I'm going to start building these into boxes. I'm going to use that central point over and over again to create buildings. We're going to be trapped in the middle of Manhattan. There's no way out. At this point, I'm just doing vertical and horizontal lines on the tops, but I'm going to put in some diagonal buildings too, because not all buildings are square on the lot and not all streets line up. I'm also going to put some windows on there, and just like I did before, I'm going to map out some different floors. You can see by using the diagonal, I can space my floors so as they come closer down on the ground to me, they get larger and larger, and I can just eyeball it too. I'm going to do that for most of this, is just sort of eyeballing things as I go along, putting in different types of what I might consider to be department store or skyrise building windows on all of these. I'm going to try to mirror the top of the building whenever I do that. Notice that the windows on one side of the building will line up with windows on another side. Also, I don't do the same sorts of windows on each of the buildings. That would be dull. So I'm going to do some horizontal, some vertical, and I'll even do some coffered windows as we go along. Just sort of putting them in somewhat randomly, somewhat the same. I have lines going to the vanishing point and then lines that mirror the tops of the buildings. That means that if I don't start out horizontal and vertical, suppose I start at a 45-degree angle, I want to make sure that the top of the building on the sides matches the windows on the sides. Not vertical, not horizontal, but at that 45-degree angle. And that's going to be sort of difficult. But as long as I look at the top of the building, I can figure out which way each of the windows should be going. Now remember, my single vanishing point is my third vanishing point above the horizon. There's one below the horizon, above the horizon. I'm standing on the one below the horizon, if you can believe that. This is the way you put in coffered windows, just like floors, but you put in little spaces between them. I'm going to speed the video up quite a bit now so that you can see the process without having to deal with each of the individual windows and buildings. You can see that I'm putting in more and more. Some of them will be angled. My windows will match whatever's at the top. On this building here, you can see that I'm putting in windows across two different sections. It's sort of a U-shaped building, but it's facing at us. For a couple of more common buildings, and I'm going to put in another building with coffered windows. You can see that I'm lining them all up. I'm adding onto the side of the building, taking off a little bit from the other, and getting all those lines in between erased out and then darkened up. I'm going to darken the windows so that it gives a little bit of visual interest as we go along. And then I'm going to put in a cylindrical building, and to do that I'm going to start with a circle up in the sky. And that circle then I'm going to use what are called tangent lines, where it just touches the edges of the circle going down, and I'll erase the back side of the circle. So now I have a circular building. I need to match each of these circles as they go down each floor. Just doing it the best I can by eye and hand, getting them nice and cylindrical, and then I'm going to put in vertical lines, which aren't really vertical, lines to the vanishing point to give it more coffered type windows going down. And you can see that I'm just filling in space with buildings, with windows. I'm eyeballing most of this. I'm not even using those diagonals. I just know that as the floors get closer down to me, they need to get larger, and they need to match up with the floors that I've already drawn that connect to them. Over and over and over again, I'm putting in buildings at different angles to make a truly claustrophobic skyline. At this point, I picked up a huge blending stump. I decided to put the sky in, just in gray tones. And I'm going to do a little bit of shading on these buildings, not a whole lot. The linear perspective lines are giving us most of our depth cues. But if I look at these windows and get them dark, and then if I can take some of that dark and move it around so that the buildings in the back become a little bit darker, and I can shade one side of some of these buildings, it will look more and more like there's depth to it in one building covering in front of another. Just like in this place that we have drawn, sometimes it's easy to get lost in linear perspective, but as long as you follow the rules and know what rules you're breaking when you do, you should be able to create illusions like this with less effort than you think. It takes a while because each of the lines is put in individually, and you're going to have to find that vanishing point over and over again. But in the end, the illusion is worth it.